The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Katie Morrison pulled her blonde hair into a bun, the overhead panels casting everything in that particular shade of white that made skin look like it belonged on a corpse. 8 months at Seattle General in Atlanta. 8 months of night shifts, steady hands, and the kind of invisibility that came from being competent without being memorable. She'd learned this skill long before she learned to start fours, how to move through a space without displacing air, how to exist without demanding acknowledgement. The antiseptic smell hit her nostrils as she pushed through the ICU doors at 1938, that chemical sharpness mixing with stale coffee from the break room and something else underneath. Something like copper and regret, though that last part was only in her head. The unit was a cathedral of machines tonight. Ventilators wheezed in steady rhythm. Heart monitors beeped their mechanical liturgy. 12 beds, 9 occupied, and Katie's eyes catalogued each one before she'd taken 3 steps: room for stable, room 6 trending down, room 8 needed labs drawn before midnight, room 11 was the new admit from trauma, a colonel, according to the chart. Green Beret. Her shoulders tensed fractionally at the designation, a response her body gave before her mind caught up with it. She pressed her hand against the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden beneath 3 layers of professional distance and scrubs, and let the gesture ground her. Muscle memory of a different life. A different name. Morrison. The voice came from behind the med cart. Jennifer, one of the residents, barely looked up from the computer screen. "You're on the North Wing rotation tonight. Pierce is doing grand rounds at 2015. He's in a mood." Katie nodded once, said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for her. She'd spent years in silence. Months in deserts where your voice could get you killed. So she just pulled her badge from her pocket, the weight of it cool against her palm, and headed toward the supply room to gather her equipment. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from having done this 10,000 times. For kits. Gloves. Alcohol prep pads. The order mattered. The ritual mattered. It was the only ritual she had left that was legal. The trauma admit in room 11 was hooked to enough machinery to power a small village. Ventilator. 2 4 pumps. Continuous cardiac monitoring. A nasogastric tube snaking down toward his stomach. And a face she recognized. Colonel Marcus Halloway. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, not Green Beret. The chart lied about that, which meant someone had lied on purpose or nobody had bothered to correct it. Marcus had been her son's commanding officer at Bagram for years ago. She'd seen him exactly 3 times in official capacity before she was buried so deep in classified redactions that even her own mother didn't know she'd existed. The recognition hit her like a round through body armor, sudden, shocking, leaving her standing very still while her hand steadied on the 4-pole. His eyes were closed. Sedated. His left leg was wrapped in compression bandages and his chart read like a tragedy written in medical shorthand: motor vehicle accident, blunt force trauma, possible internal injuries, imaging pending. Katie moved to his vitals. Blood pressure 142/89. Heart rate 96. O2 sat 94. Respiratory rate 18. The numbers told her what his body was saying: pain. Compensation. Something hurt that they couldn't see yet. She glanced at the imaging orders. CT chest and abdomen pending. Pending. Waiting for approval. Waiting for Dr. Pierce. She was still reviewing the chart when the doors burst open and Pierce swept through like he owned the oxygen in the room. He was tall, the kind of tall that made people listen before he spoke, with a surgeon's hands and a bully's instinct for weakness. 53, according to hospital HR, but he moved like someone younger, like someone who'd never been told no. His white coat was pristine, which was how Katie knew he'd spent the day in offices instead of bedside. A man who did actual clinical work got bloodstains. The residents assembled behind him like disciples gathering for sermon. 6 of them, ranging from MS3 to chief resident, and Katie watched their body language compress, their spines straightening, their eyes redirecting downward in the universal posture of people bracing for impact. Grand rounds. She'd heard about Pierce's grand rounds, the teaching method that had caused 3 residents to request transfers in the last 6 months. Room 11, Pierce announced, not looking at the patient, looking instead at the assembled young doctors. Our admit from the motor vehicle incident. Let's talk about pre-hospital decision-making, or more accurately, the lack thereof. He pulled up the chart on the wall-mounted tablet. Katie continued adjusting the colonel's bed position, kept her face neutral, kept her hand steady. The art of invisibility. Make yourself useful without being noticed. She'd written this playbook years ago. Medics arrived on scene at 14:22, Pierce continued, his voice taking on that pedagogical tone that made Katie's jaw tighten by approximately 2 millimeters, barely perceptible, only visible if you knew what to look for. Transport time 18 minutes. They elected not to call ahead for trauma activation. He paused. Let that land. They also failed to request imaging orders on arrival. Would someone care to explain why we're not imaging this patient? A silence that tasted like stale coffee and fear. Katie turned the bed a few degrees, checked the Foley catheter output. Golden. Clear. Normal. The colonel's abdomen was tense, though she could feel it through the blankets. Guarding. That meant something hurt inside. Because the residents didn't order them, Pierce said, answering his own question. Because the nursing staff, his eyes flicked toward Katie for exactly 0.3 seconds, the kind of dismissal that used to land with weight before she'd learned how to not let it, failed to flag the obvious deficiency in the chart. Katie's jaw tightened another millimeter. Still invisible. Imaging should have been called stat on arrival, he continued, his voice carrying that particular quality of certainty that belongs exclusively to people who'd never had to choose between calling for help and staying hidden. This patient's injury pattern suggests possible retroperitoneal bleeding, which means we're looking at a narrow window before decompensation. Every minute we delay increases mortality risk significantly. One of the residents, a young man with dark eyes and shoulders that hadn't yet learned to carry the weight of doubt, raised his hand. Should I order the CT now, Dr. Pierce? Pierce smiled. It was not a kind expression. That would be the bare minimum of competent medical practice, yes. Now that we've discussed it, instead of doing it while patient outcomes clock backward. He turned, his presence making the air in the room feel pressurized. And someone might consider asking the bedside nurse if she noticed any clinical indicators that would warrant imaging. Assuming she has the competence to recognize them. The eyes of all 6 residents moved to Katie. She was adjusting the ventilator settings, her back to Pierce, her hands moving with a kind of mechanical precision that belongs to people who'd done this in a transport helicopter at 10,000 feet under conditions that made this ICU look like a country club. She didn't turn around. She did her job. The ventilator required a pressure adjustment based on the patient's oxygen saturation curve, and that needed doing whether or not an arrogant doctor was performing for an audience of terrified trainees. I see, Pierce said to the silence. The nursing staff has nothing to contribute. Let's move on to the next patient, and perhaps someone can explain how we can simultaneously provide competent critical care while our protocols are being ignored from both the medical and nursing perspectives. They moved to room 10. Katie didn't watch them go. She was counting the colonel's capillary refill, 2 seconds, normal, and noting the slight asymmetry in his chest rise that suggested his left lung might not be expanding fully. Compensation. Guarding. Pain. The body's signals were there if you knew how to read them. If you'd spent 16 hours holding a trauma line together in Kandahar province under mortar fire, the ICU's quietness started to feel like the luxury it was. The vending machine was near the medication dispensary, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they were sharing secrets nobody wanted to hear. Katie was pulling a coffee at 20:48 when Pierce found her, his footsteps announcing his arrival with the weight of someone who believed the floor should move for him instead of him moving across it. Morrison. His voice was exactly the volume it needed to be for the orderly stocking supplies for feet away to hear every word clearly. Room 11 is now imaging. I've ordered CT chest and abdomen, which should have been done hours ago. Katie withdrew her coffee from the machine. The liquid inside was dark enough to be dangerous and warm enough to be therapeutic. She turned, looked at him directly, said nothing. "Did you hear me?" Pierce's jaw was shifting subtly, like he was working something between his teeth. "I said the imaging should have been ordered immediately upon admission." "Yes, sir." Katie's voice was exactly the same calm tone she used when she was asking families if they had any questions about code status. No inflection. No apology. No admission of fault. "And yet somehow I had to demonstrate to an entire team of residents that you failed to advocate for this patient appropriately." He stepped closer. Not threateningly, this wasn't physical, but with the intention of occupying her space, of making her smaller. "Maybe you should stick to bedpans, Morrison, since complex care seems beyond you." The orderly stopped moving. Katie could feel him watching. She could feel the air in the hallway compressing. She pulled her coffee from the machine slowly, deliberately. The plastic cup felt warm in her hands. She looked at Pierce for exactly 1 second, held his gaze without flinching, and then turned back to the machine to dispose of the receipt. Not running. Not retreating. Just continuing her work as if he'd commented on the weather. She could feel him waiting for something, a reaction, a defense, a crack in the composure. When none came, he made a sound that might have been frustration or might have been something else, and then his footsteps moved away down the corridor. The orderly resumed stocking supplies. Katie held her coffee and didn't drink it. Instead she walked back to the north wing, back to room 11, back to the colonel who needed imaging and probably needed somebody to advocate for him until the machines confirmed what her hands had already felt beneath sterile gloves. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. The heart monitors beat their mechanical liturgy. She had no idea what happened next would change everything. The heart monitors beat their mechanical liturgy through the empty corridor. Katie checked the colonel's vitals one final time before clocking out, her fingers steady as she documented his labs in precise, measured script. 88% oxygen saturation. Blood pressure climbing. Stable. She'd done what the protocol demanded. What the colonel needed. What Dr. Pierce had refused to authorize. She didn't expect him to be waiting by the vending machine. The hallway outside the break room was a thin slice of fluorescent purgatory, dimly lit and colder than it should have been at 2 a.m. Pierce stepped into her path with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who could enforce it. His white coat was pristine, pressed, the kind of expensive clean that came from hospital laundry services that cost money Katie didn't have. Behind him, an orderly pretended to refill a supply cart. Katie. Not her name. A sound like a name, wrapped in contempt. Interesting choice this evening. She pulled her coffee from the machine. The cup dropped with a plastic click into the slot. She reached for it, her movements unhurried, each gesture measured like she was performing surgery on the air itself. Around them, the hospital hummed with its 2 a.m. rhythm, ventilators sighing, monitors ticking their digital heartbeats, the distant sound of a stretcher moving through the corridors. The colonel's imaging order, Pierce continued, moving closer. "You knew I had reasons for the delay. Medical judgment, Katie. Complex case management. Seems beyond your scope, though, doesn't it? Maybe you should stick to bedpans, where the complexity doesn't exceed your actual training." The orderly's eyes flicked toward her. Waiting. Hoping for a reaction, a stammer, a flush, the kind of visible wound that would make a good story in the break room tomorrow. Katie sipped her coffee. It was lukewarm. She'd need to reheat it. She turned toward the microwave with the same calm efficiency she'd shown while questioning the colonel's care plan. Pierce was still talking. She heard him the way she might hear traffic on a distant highway, present, inevitable, completely irrelevant to her trajectory. "Did you hear me?" His voice had sharpened, the frustration of a man unused to being ignored. "I'm speaking to you." "I heard you, Dr. Pierce." She placed the cup in the microwave and pressed 90 seconds. Her voice carried no inflection, no tremor, no apology. Just fact delivered in the neutral tone of someone reading a temperature. "Bedpans. Scope limitation. I'm aware of your concerns. The microwave hummed to life. 30 seconds elapsed. 60. The orderly finally gave up and pushed the supply cart toward the other end of the corridor. Pierce waited until the footsteps faded, and then the real conversation began, the one that happened when witnesses disappeared. He leaned against the counter with practiced nonchalance, but Katie could see the muscle tightening along his jaw. A man accustomed to authority suddenly uncertain of his own power. It was the smallest thing, barely visible, but she'd spent 16 years reading the physical language of people under stress, and Dr. Pierce was stressed. "Here's what concerns me," he said quietly, and the quiet was worse than volume. "You're questioning my clinical decisions. You're second-guessing treatment protocols. You're a night shift nurse, Katie, which means you're exactly 17 steps below the people who make actual decisions about patient care." 90 seconds. The microwave beeped. She opened it without hurrying, pulled out the cup, added nothing to it. No sugar. No cream. Black coffee pulled from a cooling machine by a woman who'd learned long ago that comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford. "That patient," he continued, "will be managed according to my assessment. Not because you think you know better. Not because you have some invisible qualification you've never mentioned to anyone. But because I'm the physician, and you're not. You understand the distinction?" She turned to face him, and that's when something shifted in the fluorescent half-light. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that Pierce probably didn't even register, her eyes moved with a particular kind of focus. Not angry. Not defensive. The kind of focus that came from having assessed hundreds of situations where hesitation meant death. Her hand, holding the coffee, was completely still. Unshaking. The hand of someone who'd held bleeding hands in the dark and never spilled anything important. "I understand," she said. And she did. She understood that Pierce needed this. Needed to establish dominance over someone smaller, quieter, less threatening. Needed to confirm his own authority through her visible submission. She understood because she'd seen the same pattern in junior officers who'd never actually led men under fire. The ones who needed to prove something every single morning. "Good," Pierce said, straightening. "Because I'm done with the questioning. You clear with that? Any more concerns about my clinical judgment, any more unauthorized suggestions about imaging, and we're going to have a different conversation. One that involves HR and a formal investigation. I have documentation going back to your first week here." Katie didn't respond. She walked past him toward the door, and as she did, something else happened, something so small that only someone trained in tactical assessment would have noticed. Her posture shifted. Not dramatically. Not visibly to anyone watching for tears or anger or any of the conventional signs of breakdown. But there was a straightening of the spine, a dropping of the shoulders that suggested the burden had been taken on, categorized, and filed. Not ignored. Calculated. The next morning, she arrived for her shift to find Dr. Pierce waiting at the nurse's station with security. A clipboard thick with forms. His expression was the expression of a man who'd decided the conversation from last night hadn't actually been enough. Who'd spent the hours between then and now building a structure that couldn't be questioned or challenged, only dismantled. "Katie Morrison," he said, loud enough for the day shift nurses to hear. Loud enough for every clinical decision she'd ever made to become suddenly suspect in the room's collective consciousness. "We need to talk about your recent behavior patterns." The clipboard rose. His hand was steady. He'd been building this structure for a while, she realized. This wasn't spontaneous. This was architecture. "I have documented incidents going back 8 weeks, Pierce continued, reading from pages that probably bore her name in all the wrong contexts. Flagrant scope violations. Questionable medication administration. Unsupervised patient advocacy that compromised clinical judgment. Each one a separate incident. Each one a pattern." One of the younger nurses, Torres, maybe 19 years in, still naive enough to believe the system protected nurses, made a small noise of confusion. The security guard shifted his weight, waiting for her to cry, to argue, to give him a reason to justify his presence. Katie listened to the list. And as she listened, something moved behind her sternum. Not anger. Not fear. But a kind of door closing. A kind of recognition. She'd been erased before. The military had been very thorough about it. Every record of Captain Catherine Morrison filed and sealed. Every citation redacted. Every file marked classified. She'd walked into Seattle General in Atlanta 8 months ago as exactly what Dr. Pierce saw, just a nurse, nothing underneath the uniform but competence and silence. But that door that was closing now, the one where she let the erasure happen again, where she allowed herself to become small enough that a man like Pierce could carry her on a clipboard, that door had been sealed shut in a field hospital outside Bagram, in a place that didn't exist on any map, in a moment when she'd realized the world didn't want to know what she was capable of. One more lapse in judgment, Pierce was saying, and we'll need to have a conversation with administration about your employment status. You understand? She understood. She understood perfectly. Understood that Pierce had given her an ultimatum wrapped in paperwork because he was smart enough to know that formal destruction was more permanent than visible violence. That he'd built a case that would stand up in HR meetings, that would protect him if she escalated, that would ensure that if she tried to question his decisions again, the hospital would have already decided she was the problem. She understood, and for the first time since walking through the doors of Seattle General, something in her changed. Not visibly. The other nurses didn't notice. The security guard didn't notice. Pierce, looking down at his clipboard, didn't notice the moment when she stopped being compliant and simply became still. Because 16 years ago, in a field hospital that officially didn't exist, Captain Catherine Morrison had held together a trauma line for 9 hours alone. Had made medical decisions that had no authorization because authorization wasn't available. Had saved lives that weren't supposed to be saved, using knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist. And they'd buried her for it. All that experience, all that training, all that competence, sealed away so thoroughly that even she'd learned to hide it from herself. But Pierce had just made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed she was breakable in the conventional way. He didn't know who was standing in front of him. The monitor's soft beat marked time like a metronome. 11:43 p.m. Katie checked the Colonel's O2 sat, 92%, steady, normal, holding. She adjusted his for flow, the plastic tubing cold between her fingers, and noted the time in his chart. 2 hours until her break. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of blood from the trauma bay 2 rooms down. The Colonel slept. He's breathing even. His chest rising and falling beneath the thin hospital blanket with a mechanical predictability of someone whose body was finally healing. Katie had watched enough trauma patients to recognize the signs. The worst was past. The crisis had broken. By morning, he'd be talking, complaining about hospital food, maybe asking about the game score on ESPN. The kind of recovery that made 12-hour shifts feel purposeful. She moved to the next patient. Room for 12. Routine vitals. The fluorescent strips overhead cast everything in the color of old bone. Then the alarm came. Not the gentle reminder that medication was due. Not the soft alert that a patient's BP had drifted into a cautious zone. The full code alarm. The heart monitor screaming its fractal frequency into the silence. Katie's head snapped toward the Colonel's room before her conscious mind caught up to what she'd heard. She moved. The monitor showed it immediately, dramatic oxygen desaturation. The SAT was already down to 82% and plummeting like a stone. His heart rate compensating wildly, pushing past 140 beats per minute, each one more frantic than the last. Katie's eyes registered the pattern before fear could crystallize. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart. The Colonel's body was running out of time in the way that trauma patients did, exponentially, mercilessly, with no margin for hesitation. The night resident, Dr. Matheson, stood at the foot of the bed. Young. 2 months out of his residency. His hands were moving, but not toward anything useful. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His eyes had the particular glassiness of someone whose training had never actually equipped him for the moment his training was supposed to handle. "Page Dr. Pierce." "Now," Katie said. Not a request. The words came out with the flat certainty of someone used to being obeyed. Matheson fumbled for his pager. His fingers looked like they belonged to someone else. Katie was already grabbing the needle decompression kit from the crash cart. Her hands moved with the mechanical precision of muscle memory that transcended civilian life. 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. Not under these lights. In a Black Hawk at 10,000 feet while rounds punched through the fuselage and the field medic screamed coordinates into a radio and she held the line together with her voice and her hands because there was no one else and the alternative was losing a soldier on her watch. Pain was information. Pain was data. The Colonel's O2 sat dropped to 68%. Katie's scrubs were already moving. She prepped the site with the speed of someone who'd done this in darkness, in sand, in the percussion of incoming fire. The Colonel's chest heaved. His pupils dilated. The look of a body that understood it was suffocating. "Where's Pierce?" Katie called out. Not to Matheson. To the nurse at the station. "He's not answering his phone. I've tried twice." Of course he wasn't. Later, Katie would learn that Dr. Pierce had slipped down to the parking garage at 2:14 a.m., negotiating kickback rates with a medical supply contractor. $200 per unnecessary imaging order. $300 for surgical referrals that lined his pockets instead of serving patients. He was doing mathematics with a man in a Lexus while a patient died upstairs. Katie didn't wait. Couldn't wait. She positioned the needle at the landmark, the thin space between ribs, the anatomical whisper that meant the difference between life and cellular death. The Colonel's breathing came in gasps. His body thrashing against the restraint of his own deterioration. She pushed the needle home. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and violent. The sound of pressure releasing, of a lung re-expanding, of a body getting a second chance at the most basic function it had. The needle went in at an angle, smooth, practiced, the kind of smooth that came from having done it when the cost of failure was watching someone's eyes go dark. The monitor responded. O2 sat climbing. 75, 82. 88, 92. Stable. The Colonel's breathing loosened. His chest fell back into rhythm. His pupils constricted. The wild panic drained from his body like someone had pulled a plug. Matheson stood frozen, watching her hands the way a student watches a master. Katie didn't look at him. She was already checking the needle placement, already securing it with tape, already scanning for the next problem. "Get me a chest X-ray." "Portable unit," she said. "Call respiratory. I want a thoracostomy tray assembled in case we need it." That's not within your scope," Matheson said. The words came out small, apologetic. "Do it." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of authority that made residency training seem like a child's game. The Colonel's O2 sat held steady at 92%. His heart rate began its descent from panic back into reasonable territory. By the time the portable X-ray machine arrived, 63 seconds later, his vital signs had stabilized enough that Katie could finally breathe. That was when Dr. Pierce appeared. He came through the door moving fast, already composing his face into the expression of a surgeon arriving to manage a crisis, the expression of someone who expected to save the day. He stopped when he saw the needle secured to the Colonel's chest. His eyes moved from the device to Katie. His jaw tightened fractionally. "Morrison. Step away from the patient." Katie was already annotating the chart. O2 sat climbed to 92% following needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Vitals responding. Chest X-ray ordered. She didn't look up. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she spoke, came from a place so deep it sounded like it belonged to someone else entirely. Tension pneumothorax. Resident was frozen. You weren't available. Pierce looked at the needle. Looked at the monitor showing the colonel's stable rhythm. Looked at Katie in a way that suggested he was recalibrating some fundamental assumption about what he'd been dealing with. I'll take it from here. Your choice, Katie said. She moved away from the bed with the same efficiency she'd brought to everything else. Her scrubs were still clean. Her breathing had never accelerated. Her hands had found their way back to stillness. But Pierce saw something in those hands as she walked past. Calluses in patterns that didn't match a nurse's typical wear. Small white scars running across the knuckles in configurations that told stories. The kind of hands that had held weight. The kind of hands that knew how to do things outside a hospital's sterile protocols. His eyes followed those hands all the way to the door. The night resident was still standing at the foot of the bed. He'd watched the entire procedure. Watched Katie move with the certainty of someone who'd done this in circumstances he couldn't imagine. Watched her voice drop an octave. Watched her take command of a room the way command was supposed to work, not through authority, but through competence so absolute that authority became irrelevant. Who was she? Matheson asked Pierce quietly. Pierce didn't answer. But something in his expression suggested he was asking himself the same question. And something about the way Katie had moved, the precision, the terminology, the voice that belonged to chain of command, suggested the answer was going to be more complicated than a simple night shift nurse. She didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. Her composure had never cracked. But when she passed by the monitor on her way out, when she saw the colonel's O2 sat holding steady at 94%, something shifted behind her eyes. Something that looked like satisfaction. Something that looked like muscle memory finally, after 8 months of stillness, finding its purpose again. The night shift continued. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. And Katie moved through the rest of her rounds with the same quiet competence that had always defined her, except now the question had been asked, who is this woman, really? What training, what experience, what hidden depth had just saved a patient that no one else in that room could have saved? Before dawn, Dr. Pierce sat in the administrative office with his laptop balanced on one knee, fingers moving across the keyboard with the precision of someone writing his own mythology. The incident report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic demolition. He dated it 0247 hours, time-stamped it to the minute the colonel's monitor had flatlined, and built his case in paragraphs that read like scripture. Gross negligence. Scope violation. Patient endangerment. Unauthorized procedures performed by personnel without appropriate credentialing. He copied administration, CSIT risk management, BCC the State Nursing Board, each destination another nail. The words were careful, professional, unassailable. Pierce had learned long ago that the best lies wore a suit and carried a clipboard. By the time the day shift arrived, the document had already traveled through 3 bureaucratic channels, each one stamping it with institutional weight before Katie Morrison even knew her career was being dismantled. By noon, it was done. A compliance officer found her on the 4th floor, in the hallway outside the colonel's room, checking the new resident's dosing calculations. Ms. Morrison, you need to come with me. Not a request. Not a conversation. The officer was young, maybe 30, uncomfortable with the task because she could see something in Katie's face that suggested this was not an ordinary suspension. They walked to the administrative office in silence, Katie's shoes clicking against the tile with each step, that sound like a countdown no one could stop. The room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and photocopier toner. A folder sat on the desk, 3 inches thick, filled with Pierce's paperwork, his allegations, his carefully constructed evidence of incompetence. Your badge is deactivated effective immediately, the compliance officer said. Your access to the hospital system is revoked. Security will escort you to your locker and then to the exit. You're on suspension pending investigation. Your union rep will contact you within 48 hours. Katie didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. Didn't explain that the procedure she'd performed was textbook, that she'd saved a man's life with the kind of precision that only came from having done it in a transport helicopter at 10,000 feet. She simply nodded, turned, and walked to the nurse's station where her locker waited. The security guard followed at a respectful distance. He'd worked at Seattle General for 8 years and he'd seen her hand save people twice over, but he said nothing. The locker was metal, dented, smaller than a coffin. Everything inside fit into a cardboard box, a sweater she kept for the brutal air conditioning of the ICU, a pair of compression socks, a flash drive with her continuing education credits, 3 protein bars, and the jacket. The one she never wore, the one she kept in the back corner like a ghost of someone else. She pulled it out and held it for a moment, the worn fabric heavy with memory, the faded unit patch from the 1st Special Forces group still sewn inside the lining, the stitches holding it together the way thread holds together everything worth keeping. The patch was the size of a postage stamp, worn nearly colorless by time and hands and 16 years of being carried against skin that had learned to survive things most people couldn't name. The cardboard box felt heavier as she carried it toward the exit. Heavier than it had any right to be, heavier than her field pack had ever been, even loaded with ammunition and blood packs and the weight of keeping soldiers alive on a mountainside. The security guard opened the double doors. The afternoon light hit her face, real light, outdoor light, the kind that was too bright for someone who'd spent the last 8 months in fluorescent everything. She didn't look back at the building. Didn't acknowledge the guard's quiet "Good luck, Ms. Morrison." Just walked across the parking lot in a straight line, the box clutched against her chest, her eyes straight ahead, the way a soldier moves when they've already accepted the loss. That evening, her son found her at the kitchen table. 16 years old, hair dark like his father's, eyes that saw too much because his mother had never learned how to hide her tells from him. The cardboard box sat beside her, open, the jacket folded on top like a surrender. Katie had been staring at it for 3 hours, unable to explain to him why she was home on a Tuesday night, unable to tell him that she'd been fired for saving someone's life, unable to say any of the words that needed saying because they were all classified, all buried, all erased from every database that mattered. She'd been ordered into silence after Operation Crosswind. The mission itself had been scrubbed from official records, her service erased, her rank redacted, her existence removed from every channel where it could surface and complicate things. The Pentagon had made it clear, you stay invisible, you stay safe. You stay invisible, your family stays safe. You surface, and everything burns. Mom. Her son's voice was careful, the way teenagers get when they're testing whether it's safe to ask. Why are you home? Katie's eyes were burning. Not with tears, soldiers didn't cry. That was a rule she'd internalized so completely it lived in her bones, but with the kind of pressure that came from holding something impossible in. She looked at her son's face and saw the colonel in his features, saw the green beret in his bearing even at 16, and realized that saving the colonel had cost her the only identity she'd been allowed to keep. I made a mistake at work, she said, and the lie tasted like copper. They're investigating some procedures I performed. Her son was quiet. He was always quiet, this kid, and Katie wondered sometimes if that was genetics or if it was osmosis, if 16 years of living with a woman who'd learned silence as a survival mechanism had taught him the same language. Were they the right procedures, he asked. Katie didn't answer. She couldn't. She reached down and touched the unit patch through the jacket fabric, feeling its outline against her palm like a rosary bead, like the last thing she owned that proved she'd ever been anyone at all. The weight of the cardboard box, the weight of the suspended badge, the weight of the identity she'd buried so carefully that even her own son didn't fully know what she'd survived. She wanted to tell him about Bagram, about the phi base that had been overrun, about 9 hours holding a trauma line alone while the world exploded around her, about the call sign only 4 people in theater had known. She wanted to tell him she was Valkyrie 6, or had been, before the Pentagon told her to disappear. I'm sorry, she whispered instead. I'm sorry I can't tell you. He sat down across from her and they didn't speak, mother and son, separated by a kitchen table and 16 years of secrets, connected by blood and by a colonel lying in a hospital bed who owed his life to hands that weren't supposed to exist. The rain started outside, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windows like the rotor blades of a helicopter that wasn't coming anymore. Katie pulled the jacket toward her, touched the patch again, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought about throwing it all away. The box, the patch, the memories, the entire buried life that had gotten her nothing but this kitchen table at 8:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, unemployed and suspended and trying to explain to her child why she was crying without telling him she'd seen the worst of human beings and survived it, and that surviving it had made her competent enough to save the wrong person's life. But her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Check outside." Katie's head snapped up. Through the kitchen window, she could see them, 3 Black Hawk helicopters, silhouettes against the darkening sky, descending toward the hospital's roof pad with the inevitability of a thunderstorm that nobody could stop. The sound reached the house a moment later, that familiar thud of rotor wash shaking windows, rattling dishes in the cabinet, the kind of noise that meant people with authority and resources had finally noticed that something was wrong. Her son's eyes went wide. "Mom, what the?" "Stay here," Katie said, and her voice had changed. Not asking. Commanding. The way a captain speaks when the situation is no longer theoretical. "Lock the doors. Don't answer unless it's me." She grabbed the jacket and stepped out into the rain. It fell on her face, soaked into the fabric, and she breathed it in like it was fuel. The helicopters weren't coming for Dr. Pierce. Not yet. They were coming because somewhere in that hospital, a colonel who shouldn't be alive was asking a question that was about to rewrite everything. And the only person who could answer it was standing alone in the rain, finally, no longer invisible. The Pentagon liaison stood beside Dr. Pierce in the hospital corridor, his voice low and measured like a metronome counting down the seconds before detonation. "The fraud investigation you demanded, the one you believed would discredit Captain Morrison, has uncovered your entire billing scheme. $3,240,000 in inflated claims across 47 patients over 18 months. Kickbacks from Medtronic, Cardinal Health, and 3 independent contractors. Federal marshals are in the lobby. They've been waiting 17 minutes. Pierce's face went the color of clinic walls, all the blood draining at once like someone had opened a valve. His mouth worked silently. Words didn't come. The liaison turned and walked toward the board hearing without waiting for a response, his shoes clicking on the tile with the finality of a cell door closing. Pierce stood motionless in the hallway, understanding crystallizing behind his eyes. The investigation he'd weaponized, the one he'd filed with such meticulous bureaucratic precision, building his documentation fortress brick by brick, had been live the entire time. The hospital had hired external auditors. They'd traced his consulting contracts. They'd found the shell corporations. They'd reviewed 17 years of his billing patterns and found the deviation exactly the month Katie Morrison started asking questions about a colonel's CT scan, the month she began noticing inconsistencies in his charting. His attempt to silence her had triggered the mechanism that would dismantle him. He walked into the board hearing. Katie sat beside the colonel, who wore a wheelchair and carried the bearing of a man who'd already survived things that killed other people. Her son stood holding a show box. A Marine officer in dress blues leaned against the wall with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. A 2-star general stood by the window with classified clearance written in every line of his uniform. And in the back, near the door, 2 federal marshals in dark suits waited with handcuffs and a warrant that detailed 47 counts of insurance fraud, 2 counts of Medicare embezzlement, and 1 count of obstruction of justice for deliberately interfering with patient care to cover his tracks. Pierce tried to interrupt after the Marine officer began reading her citation, her actual citation, detailing the firefight at Bagram where Captain Morrison held a trauma line alone for 9 hours, where she'd saved the lives of 23 soldiers with nothing but a combat knife and the kind of medicine you do when there's no backup and the only choice is excellence or death. "Hospital protocol requires," Pierce started, his voice cracking. The Pentagon liaison turned, and the moment their eyes met, Pierce understood the real meaning of exposure. Not to the hospital. To the federal government. To people who had resources that made hospital boards look like parent-teacher conferences. The marshals moved with the precision of people who'd executed this warrant before. Handcuffs clicked against Pierce's wrists with a sound like a gun safety releasing. They read him his rights in voices that sounded bored, which somehow made it worse. Nobody touched him roughly. Nobody shouted. They simply escorted him past the nurse's station, past the staff who'd watched him humiliate colleagues for 17 years, past the oxygen carts and the vital sign monitors, and into a federal holding vehicle that looked less like a car and more like the final punctuation mark on everything he'd built. Katie watched him go without changing her expression, her hands steady as they'd always been. The board chair called for a 15-minute recess. The colonel reached over and squeezed her son's shoulder. The general returned to his phone call. The Marine officer closed his binder. The room exhaled like someone had been holding their breath for 18 months. 6 months later, Katie and her son drove past a medical supply depot in a strip mall on the outskirts of Atlanta, the kind of place where people bought compression stockings and wound care supplies and learned to accept that their careers had been reduced to the singular task of not making any more mistakes. Through the warehouse window, visible past the boxes stacked 5 high, was Dr. Sterling Pierce. Not doctor anymore. The name tag stitched over his shirt pocket read Steve in blue thread on a blue polyester uniform that probably cost $14. He was loading boxes, medical equipment, the same equipment he'd once controlled the supply contracts for, the same equipment he'd profited from, into a cargo van. His hands moved with the mechanical quality of someone doing penance in the form of physical labor. He flinched when a coworker called his name. Not his new name, his old one, the title he'd worn like armor for 2 decades. Katie didn't slow down. Her son didn't point. They drove on through the Atlanta traffic like they'd never seen him at all, like he was invisible now, like the world had simply decided he no longer existed, and the irony of that, the irony of becoming what he'd tried to make her become, landed on her with the weight of a closing door. On Katie's bedroom wall at home, framed beside a commendation from Seattle General that read, "In recognition of exceptional professional conduct and patient advocacy," hung her captain's bars. They caught the afternoon light and held it steady. In her wallet, tucked behind her updated hospital credentials and her driver's license, was the colonel's faded unit patch, the one he'd pressed into her hand before they wheeled him out of ICU. She could feel its weight through the leather whenever she moved, a tether to the person she'd been when she had a name that mattered, when her hands had held lives together not in sterile hospital rooms but under fire, when the world knew exactly who she was and precisely what she could do. Her son asked once if she regretted the years of silence, and she sat on the porch with him in the Atlanta heat and said nothing for a long time, because the answer wasn't simple enough for words. She'd been invisible because she'd been ordered invisible. She'd been erased because the operation had to disappear and she'd chosen her son's safety over her own name. But somewhere in the 18 months of humiliation and suspension and cardboard boxes, something had shifted. The colonel had survived because of what she was. The fraud had been exposed because of who she was. And now her name was in a Pentagon file again, this time not redacted, marked not for erasure but for recognition. The hospital board offered her the director position 6 months after the hearing concluded. Chief of Trauma Medicine. Oversight of all critical care protocols. A salary with numbers that required reading twice. Katie listened to the offer in a conference room paneled in darkwood, with the board chair speaking in the careful tones of people attempting to correct historical injustice. She said thank you. She declined. And 3 weeks later she returned to Seattle General in scrubs that carried her name on a badge and her rank understood by everyone who needed to understand it, just not visible, because visibility wasn't what she needed anymore. Visibility was what she'd survived. What she needed now was the work itself. Patients who needed their hands steady. Residents who needed to learn that competence isn't negotiable. A colonel who'd requested to have her name added to his official recovery team. Her son, who understood now why his mother had kept secrets, who understood now that some kinds of strength exist in the spaces where nobody's watching. On her first day back, a code blue came through at 0337 in the morning. A patient in septic shock, organs failing, time collapsing like a house of cards. The resident froze. The attending looked to her automatically now, muscle memory overriding hierarchy. Move, Katie said, and the room reorganized itself around her the way rooms do when someone inside them knows exactly what to do. 12 minutes later, the patient stabilized. The attending shook his head slowly. "How did you know?" he started. "You check the lactate trends against the urine output first," Katie said, already charting. Then you consider the antibiotic timeline. Then you listen. She said it without drama or emphasis, the way someone might explain how to make coffee. The resident watched her work and understood something about what quiet confidence looks like when it's built on 18 years and 4 tours and the kind of medicine you practice when the only acceptable outcome is keeping someone alive. Her son picked her up after her shift. They sat in the car in the parking lot with the sun coming up over Atlanta like it had every morning for millennia, indifferent to the small human dramas of rise and fall and resurrection. "You're different now," her son said. "Not a question." Katie felt the unit patch in her wallet, her fingers brushing its faded edges. "I'm the same," she said. "I'm just not hiding anymore." The drive home took them past the medical supply depot. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Dr. Pierce was loading boxes in a warehouse somewhere, a man made invisible by the weight of his own choices, while Katie Morrison drove home with her name restored and her hand still knowing exactly what to do when the world needed saving. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the afterimage of restraint, finally released, finally allowed to settle into something quieter and more durable than any badge could ever make it. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Did that moment, when Katie walked back into that code blue despite being fired, despite having everything to lose, did that choice change what made her a warrior? Subscribe, like, and tell us, would you have walked away to protect yourself, or would you have walked back in?